Top 7 reactions of innocent convicts set free. Number 7. This is John Bunn, a story of wrongful conviction and exoneration. John Bunn, a resident of Brooklyn, New York, spent 27 years behind bars for a murder he didn't commit. He was wrongfully convicted at the young age of 14, arrested by the NYPD detective Louis Scarcella. Even after spending 16 years in prison and 11 years on parole, Bunn never lost hope and always believed in his innocence. Finally, in a turn of events, his conviction was overturned based on the wrongdoing of Detective Scarcella and the lack of probable cause for his arrest. Bunn's struggle to clear his name was long and arduous, but justice finally prevailed. However, before he left the courtroom, he had a moment with the judge, and later he filed a lawsuit against the city of New York and Detective Scarcella. John Bunn was only 14 years old when he was arrested by NYPD Detective Louis Scarcella in 1991 for the murder of Rolando Nasha. Scarcella had a history of using corrupt tactics to obtain false confessions and testimony, as well as tampering with evidence. In Bunn's case, Scarcella used a 13-year-old witness who'd already recanted her statement to convict him. At the trial, the prosecution presented a witness who claimed that he had seen Bunn on the night of the murder. However, this witness had failed to identify Bunn in a photo lineup, and his testimony was inconsistent. Furthermore, the forensic evidence presented at the trial did not implicate Bunn in the crime. Despite this, John Bunn was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Finally, in 2018, John Bunn's conviction was overturned. The New York State Supreme Court ruled that there was no probable cause for Bunn's arrest and that Detective Scarcella had used corrupt tactics to obtain his conviction. The court also noted that the prosecution had withheld evidence that could have exonerated Bunn during his trial. Number 6. This is David Ranta, a man from Brooklyn, New York, who spent 22 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. Detective Louis Scarcella arrested him for the crime, and it's yet another wrongful conviction linked to Scarcella. Ranta was put in a police lineup supervised by Scarcella, where he was identified as the shooter. However, decades later, a key witness reportedly revealed that Scarcella provided him with a description of whom to pick in the lineup. There was no physical evidence linking Ranta to the murder, and the evidence presented to the jury was allegedly fabricated. Despite this, Ranta was convicted and sentenced to 37.5 years to life in prison. After more than 2 decades, former witnesses admitted that they were pressured into testifying against Ranta. His conviction was thrown out, and after his handcuffs were removed, he hugged his family and walked out of prison a free man with all he owned thrown over his back. He reportedly received $2 million from the state and a $6.4 million settlement from the city of New York after his release. Mr. Brenton apologized for what Ranta had endured, stating that it would be an understatement and grossly inadequate. Number 5. This is Susan Mellon, who was 42 years old when she was arrested in Los Angeles, California, while taking her daughter to McDonald's for a Happy Meal. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole based on false testimony. This was the last time she saw her child for 7 years, as she was charged with murdering an ex-boyfriend. Her conviction was solely based on an informant who claimed that Mellon had confessed to the murder. Mellon spent a total of 17 years in prison until it was proven that the informant was a pathological liar and unreliable witness. Finally, Mellon's case was overturned and the conviction was dismissed. Mellon was awarded $597,000 in compensation from the state of California, and the Los Angeles City Council reportedly agreed to pay $12 million to Susan Mellon. After being released, she took her daughters back to McDonald's to enjoy a long-awaited Happy Meal. Number 4. This is Louis Vargas, who was wrongly accused and sentenced to 55 years to life for crimes he didn't commit. At the age of 29, he was living in Los Angeles, California, when he was charged with 3 sexual assaults. The police concluded that it was the same person who had committed all 3 attacks based on the similar descriptions of the crimes. Vargas was convicted on all counts and spent a total of 16 years in prison. However, the California Innocence Project tested the DNA on the remaining physical evidence and clothing from one of the victims, which proved that Vargas did not commit these crimes. The evidence undermined the prosecution's case, and Vargas was exonerated from the crimes. He sat silently as this happened. Vargas only had one simple wish from his mother when he became a free man, which was to buy her a hamburger so they could be together. Reportedly, after his exoneration, Vargas received $886,000 in state compensation. Number 3. This is Daniel Villegas, after being wrongfully accused of a double homicide in El Paso, Texas. Daniel Villegas spent 18 years in prison. At 16 years old, Villegas was arrested and reportedly coerced into signing a false confession by an El Paso detective who threatened him with physical violence and the death penalty. Despite his attempts to retract his confession, Villegas was charged with 2 counts of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison based solely on the false confession. After a retrial, Villegas was found guilty once again and given a life sentence. However, this verdict was eventually overturned and he remained out on bond, where he started a family. The third trial was the moment of truth for Villegas. He would either be able to return home with his family or face life imprisonment once again. Fortunately, the jury found Villegas not guilty and he was able to go home as a free man. He has since reportedly filed a lawsuit against the city of El Paso. Number 2. This is Ricky Jackson, who was residing in Cleveland, Ohio, when he was falsely accused and wrongly convicted of a murder at the age of 18. The main witness, a 12-year-old boy named Eddie Vernon, had been pressured by the police into testifying against Jackson, even though he had not witnessed the crime. Initially, Jackson was sentenced to death by electrocution, but after spending 2 years on death row, his sentence was reduced to life in prison. After almost 4 decades in prison, Eddie Vernon, now 52 years old, came forward and revealed the truth that he'd never seen the murder occur. This revelation led to the charges against Jackson being dropped and him being granted his freedom. For the first time in over 39 years, Jackson heard that he was a free man. Life is full of small victories, and this was a big one for Ricky Jackson. He received $1 million in compensation from the state and an additional $2.65 million for lost income. This was a significant moment for Jackson, who'd spent the majority of his life in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. Number 1. This is Kirsten Lobato, who spent 16 years incarcerated for a murder she was wrongly accused of committing. At just 18 years old, she was charged with the heinous murder of a homeless man in Las Vegas. She was initially convicted of first-degree murder, but on a retrial she was found guilty of the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter and was given a sentence of 13 to 45 years. After serving 16 years in prison, new evidence was presented that proved she was not responsible for the crime. In fact, the evidence confirmed that on the day of the victim's death, Lobato was 3 hours away with her family, making it impossible for her to have committed the crime. This photo shows Lobato enjoying her newfound freedom after being released from prison. She's overwhelmed, excited, and grateful for her freedom. Lobato has filed a lawsuit against the Las Vegas Police Department, and her compensation claim is currently ongoing. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.